Would like to welcome everybody to today's Sustainable Development Seminar. Christopher Barrett from Cornell University. He is the Stephen B. and Janice G. Ashley Professor of Applied Economics and Management, and also the International Professor of Agriculture. He is the incoming David J. Nolan Director at the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management. In addition, he's a professor in the Department of Economics and a fellow of the David Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future, all at Cornell University. After Chris will give his introductory remarks on the topic of food security and socio-political stability, he will be joined by Mark Kane and Upmanu Lall here from Columbia University. Mark Kane is the Wetleson Professor of Earth and Climate Sciences and Professor of Applied Physics and Applied Mathematics here at Columbia University. He also founded the educational program, which is an MA program in Climate and Society, which was jointly done by the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences and the U.S. Institute. Upmanu Lall is a professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Engineering, the Alan and Carol Silberstein professor there. He's also a professor in the Department of Civil Engineering and Engineering Mechanics. He directs the Columbia Water Center and is a senior research scientist at the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. So Manu will now introduce the speaker to you.
It's been my fortune to have known Chris since about 1994, 1995. When both of us were teaching at Utah State University. The main thing I can tell you is that I have not met a person who is as deeply concerned about the poor people, development in practice, as well as understanding what science can do to improve the lives of these people. Chris has been active in Africa for a very long time. He worked with pastoral societies. But that's just one, what's amazing is that his on-the-ground work in Africa happens to be just one small piece of all the things that I've seen him do. And as you will see when he gives you the presentation on the topic of food security, what Chris is amazing at in the things I've seen is taking fairly complex issues and synthesizing them very cleverly into what the key issues really are and what is a possibility of progress in moving things forward and who needs to do it. And I think that's the flavor that you can expect from this particular talk. So in that sense, this is perhaps the perfect sustainable development seminar, because this is what we set as a direction when Jeff Sachs got here in 2001 or so. And people have been talking about it, and there's been a lot of activity which is on that topic coming from an economics perspective, which is exactly what Chris looks at. There are people here possibly from the International Research Institute for Climate and Society as well, and some of them have been working on looking at development issues from a climate lens and trying to look at the role insurance plays or index insurance plays. I'm happy to tell you that this is one of the areas that Chris has also pioneered in. So if you start getting into it, and if you read the sheet that circulated on his background, you'll see that of the 260 plus papers that he has published and 34 books that are indicated there, almost every topic that's of interest to you from an economic development perspective is actually covered very succinctly and very nicely. I think with that, I'll stop wasting Chris's time and get him to come up and talk. So the topic that he's going to talk about on food security is fairly complex. It covers climate, obviously, which is why Mark is here to talk about it. It covers agronomy, it covers advances in technology, and it covers what we have to do politically and socially to actually get convergence on these issues.
This topic, food security and sociopolitical stability, is the topic of a new edited volume to which both Manu and Mark have contributed extremely important chapters. So what I'm going to present is a reflection of a group's work. As most of you know, the global food system went through very dramatic changes in the post-World War II era, culminating in the Green Revolution, as it's commonly called. But it's very easy to understate what was accomplished through scientific advances around food security in the roughly half century following World War II. At the simplest, kind of most reductionist level, the big accomplishment is that we were able to increase the stock of available nutrients in the world's food supply from being adequate to feed about 2 billion people to being adequate to feed adequately today, depending upon how you want to count, anywhere from 4 to 6 or 7 billion people. Now, there are very serious distributional questions, and if we could distribute food equitably, we'd have no hunger or malnutrition in the world at all, possible exception of a couple of trace micronutrients. But the simple accomplishment of overcoming the supply constraint on adequate nutrition for the world's population was really a remarkable accomplishment and contributed enormously to reduced poverty around the world, especially by bringing down real food prices, so that the core element of poor people's expenditures, food, fell in real terms, real wages increased appreciably, and most of the gains of the supply side progress of the Green Revolution were in fact reaped by food consumers. An important point people don't always appreciate, that although the technologies were farm-level technologies largely, and improved germplasm, improved irrigation, fertilizer use, etc., the economic gains from those technological changes accrued disproportionately to the world's food consumers and disproportionately to the poorest food consumers in Asia above all. And that's the principal pathway by which poverty reduction was achieved through the Green Revolution and the technology progress associated with agricultural systems programs of the post-World War II era. This also enabled rapid urbanization as a reliable food supply distributed from producing areas to urban centers, enabled industry to begin building a workforce that could disengage, could exit agriculture. And perhaps coincidentally, perhaps a bit more substantively causal, this is also strongly associated with what political scientists sometimes refer to as the long peace of that era after World War II. The problem is that it also induced a very dangerous complacency, that the accomplishments of that 40 or 50 years of significant investment in agricultural development around the world, culminating in, among other things, a Nobel Peace Prize for an agronomist, Norman Borlaug, that led people to gradually think that this was a solution that had resolved the problem of malnutrition permanently. Of course, it came nowhere close to achieving that, not least of which because problems of malnutrition are not just problems of agricultural production. But the challenge is intrinsic to maintaining agricultural productivity growth at a pace adequate to maintain nutrient stocks, adequate to maintain low real food prices, faded from the political radar, high-level attention began to dissipate, and the major global powers began to disinvest radically from agricultural research and development. We saw aid budgets in agriculture decrease from roughly about 20% of aid to about 4% of aid, for example, between the late 1970s and the turn of the millennium. So we saw a real problem beginning to emerge, and I think it's fair to say that part of this was the natural seeds of the successes of the era from the 1940s through the 1980s that led to what we refer to in this book as a dangerous complacency. Now, this began to capture attention just a few years ago, in 2007, 2008 in particular, as global stocks-to-use ratios, to be a bit more precise, of the major cereals fell to near historic lows, and a confluence of various factors, U.S. energy policy that began having a little bit of bite through ethanol mandates, rapid growth in China and India and other middle-income countries that associated with the nutritional transition stimulate demand for feed as well as for food. Droughts in a couple of key producing places led to the perfect storm, and we began a series of price spikes that are depicted on this graphic. On the left-hand axis, and in blue, you see real food prices, the FAO's food price series. And there are a couple of things I want you to note here in particular. One is that the historic low point was basically the turn of the millennium. In 2000, we literally hit the low point for real food prices, inflation-adjusted food prices, and held fairly steady for a while, and in 2007 began a very sharp run-up that culminated in a major price spike in 2008, especially in rice. Food prices settled back down for a bit as the global economic slowdown began to hit, and we saw another precipitous price spike that culminated in 2011, especially in wheat markets, and has tapered off again since then. These data run through mid-2013. Prices have softened a little bit more since then. But the peak to trough difference here is on the order of 40%, 35, 40%. So a very significant increase in real food prices. The red lines here give you the lagged standard deviation of these series. So as you would expect in the period of price spikes, you have a sudden spike in the standard deviation as you're getting transitory volatility. But this has settled back down to essentially the long-term pattern of price volatility. So the punchline of all of that is that through the end of the 20th century, we saw a relatively steady, oscillatory but steady convergence towards very low, historically low real food prices. And at the turn of the millennium, roughly 15 years after the peak in investment in international agricultural research and development, not coincidentally, so basically 15 years, the patent period, as people sometimes refer to it, is a common lag in when we start to see the real returns to agricultural R&D. So that all tapered off in the second half of the 80s. We saw the resulting low point in real prices right around the turn of the millennium. And as the real investments in agriculture began to decline appreciably over the course of the 80s and 90s, that built up a store of slowing yield growth in agriculture, and it culminated in what are now largely perceived to be permanently higher real food prices. So all the major organizations that forecast the future of the food economy expect, so OECD, IFPRI, FAO, they all expect real food prices to remain where they are today or to increase somewhat more over the coming 10 to 15 years. Largely driven by income, population growth, urbanization in today's low and middle income countries. The punchline is demand growth has outpaced supply growth, as agricultural R&D investments naturally led to a slowing of supply expansion around the world. Now, this is a pretty wonkish discussion at this point, and frankly, nothing that's going to capture the level of high-level policymakers, other than that real food prices do wind up getting some people agitated in a few places. And that's suddenly when people became interested in political circles, very high-level political circles. In particular, we see, coincident with that price spike from 2007 to 2008, this is a graphic reproduced from a report that quite nicely plotted episodes of food price riots in developing countries. And you probably can't read them, but in parentheses behind the names of the countries are the number of dead in these riots. And it's not surprising and not coincidental that these riots bunch right around the periods of highest food prices. So we saw episodes, many episodes, of people taking to the streets in developing countries to protest the high prices of food with which they were suddenly confronted, that left them disturbed, left them annoyed by a government that seemed to be failing to maintain the social contract. And now suddenly high-level political leaders are interested, because now food prices are translating into demonstrations, violence on the streets in countries all across the world. There were more than 45, 46 countries experienced riots during this 3-year period. It's important to note that there's a very complicated relationship between high food prices and political disturbance, and that's much of what this book is about, in fact, both understanding that relationship and at some very basic level trying to predict what's coming over the coming decade. But that relationship excited interest and created this project, because the backstory to this project is that I got a call one day from senior people in the National Intelligence Services saying, people are taking to the streets in developing countries. The White House, the State Department are worried about this. The Department of Defense is worried about this. Our allies are worried about this. And we realize that in the intelligence community, we know very little about food security and agriculture around the world. We don't understand what's happening that's driving this, and we don't know what's coming over the coming decade. So is this a transitory thing, where we just kind of buckle down, get through it, and this storm will pass? Or is this a harbinger of things to come, where we need to begin to devote more attention to food security issues? So can you perhaps pull together a group of experts, people like Mark and Manu, who can help us think through what are the issues? What's behind these phenomena, those price spikes that we saw a moment ago, and their correlation with these sorts of urban food price riots? And are these things we need to worry about? Are the underlying drivers issues that the intelligence community, the security community needs to pay attention to, not just the agricultural community? So that's the genesis of this book. That's why an economist who worries about food security issues around agricultural and development economics suddenly is wading into deep water about sociopolitical stability, about which I have no expertise and no credentials. The way to understand this story, though, is to recognize that complacency induced by high-level investment in agriculture that would earn the Nobel Peace Prize, the complacency that led to a withdrawal of investment and a high-level attention to agricultural systems and food systems around the world, naturally begat as a very bitter harvest these high real food prices that we see today, and that in their most egregious explosions led people to the streets and led to disruptions in various developing countries. And so now we get high-level attention again. The L'Aquila Summit, where President Obama extracted concessions from other G8 countries that, depending upon whether you believe the numbers or not, may have generated $22 billion towards food security. That was a very high-level statement of renewed interest in these issues. The key thing to recognize here is that these food price riots are what attracted all the attention. The overthrow of the Haitian government, which can be traced directly to the food price riots of 2008 and Haiti, in particular, excited a lot of interest in the US government. But most countries suffered food price spikes, but people didn't take to the streets. And there are at best 2 countries whose governments were overthrown as a result of high food prices. The Haitian government, where the overthrow of the government was at least partly due to consumer unrest in urban centers, in Port-au-Prince in particular, and the Malagasy government, the government of Madagascar, which, as I'll discuss in a minute, fell largely due to an enormous land deal gone bad, a land deal that was sparked by these high food prices. But that's 2 countries. And that's a small portion of the countries where there was unrest. And the countries that suffered unrest are a minority of the countries that suffered significant food price spikes. So we need to be a little careful about extrapolating here and thinking that this is where the action is around the relationship between food security and socio-political stability. But this is what ignites the interest in the high-level policymakers. So that's just to foreshadow where we're going in this book, which is that this is a very real relationship and one that one should worry about. But the deeper, more fundamental, and frankly more threatening relationship between food security and socio-political stability has different causal mechanisms, different pathways. We'll come to those in just a moment. The main driver that the group of us who contributed to this volume worry about is that high food prices naturally mean that the natural resources on which food production depends also become more valuable. Farmland in the Midwestern United States is up at record prices again today, precisely because food prices are high. Farmers are fetching relatively high prices for their commodities. 2013 will be a record year for farm profits in the United States. It's a good time to be a farmer. If it's a good time to be a farmer, it's a good time to own farmland or to control the water that is essential to farm production. And high prices then mean people naturally go and seek out those now more valuable resources. It's not a coincidence that the land grab question, as it's often referred to, emerged right in the wake of these food price spikes in 2008, 2009. So these high food prices spur demand for land, for water. One race that people aren't paying attention to yet, outside of a few very small communities, largely plant breeders, is the gene grab that's taking place, as there are very substantial rushes, not just by the private sector for intellectual property, but among governments. As you see major governments looking to secure the genetic material, the animal and plant genetic material necessary for their scientists to be able to improve cultivars, and there are emerging very serious issues of enanticommons. The competition for the crucial resources behind food production is arguably the most threatening problem that results from the high food price regime that we've entered into. The obvious example is cases like this one in Madagascar, where domestic discontent that already existed, it's not that the land deal that the government of Madagascar, the Revolves government did with Daewoo, the Korean conglomerate, where they signed a deal under rather opaque terms for about 1.25 million hectares of prime rice-producing land in the main breadbasket part of Madagascar. That was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, sent people into the streets, and a disc jockey took over the government, literally. I couldn't make that up. So very troubling for those of us who spend a lot of time in Madagascar. But there are other tensions, marine fisheries. The coastal fisheries have been expanding, capture fisheries in the oceans have been expanding by about 1 degree per year for the last 25 years. And more than 3/4 of the continental shelves of the world are now at or beyond sustainable harvest levels. There's not much capacity to continue to tap ocean capture fisheries. We're having to move to terrestrial-based aquaculture increasingly. And the competition and conflict over those fisheries is increasing. Water, Manu has a very nice chapter around competition for freshwater resources. Gene grabs and the IP anti-commons I've already talked about are other phenomena we need to worry about. But this is a very complicated area, and it's impossible for those of us who think about things statistically, as Manu and Mark and I do, to establish clean causal estimates of, as there's some shock to food security, what's the consequence for sociopolitical stability? There are some narrow relationships you can isolate. There's some nice work now that identifies very clearly a causal effect of high food prices on food riots. A pretty intuitive relationship, but one that took some rather creative econometrics to establish convincingly. So there are now some credible studies that make that identification cleanly. But the broader relationship is pretty hard to pin down in a really robust causal sense. And the reason is there are lots of correlated common drivers. So Mark has a very nice chapter on climate change and climate variability and how climate variability feeds into both food security challenges as well as instability. Some of you will be familiar with Saul Chang et al.'s recent science paper on climate change and climate shocks and violence and conflict of various sorts around the world. There are clearly common drivers here, climate being one of them, water scarcity being another, et cetera. And so isolating what's a true causal effect from food security to sociopolitical stability versus what's just a common correlation caused by some outside factor is a difficult challenge. It's frankly a challenge that our book doesn't adequately address. This is an area ripe for further investigation. But again, the reason for this book was high-level policymakers needed guidance. They want to know what are the issues they need to investigate. We simply don't have the luxury of waiting around until we have statistical evidence that satisfies our standards. We've got to be able to come up with credible best guesses for those who are making important decisions. So we've taken that rather ambitious, maybe audacious leap in this book. Why do it if we're kind of venturing outside our comfort zones as scientists? Well, the first reason is that we know that sociopolitical stability is a strong driver of food security. Places that suffer unrest, their populations are always much more vulnerable to nutritional disruption. We see abundant evidence of this. Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo are obvious examples. But the key thing for the policymakers is the strong suggestion that there's potentially a causal relationship that runs the other way too. That it's not just unrest causes food insecurity, but that food insecurity might sow the seeds of unrest as well. And that's a hypothesis worth investigating because we don't really need added reasons to seek peace. It's not like the Defense Department really needs us to come up with an agriculturally based or food systems based justification for seeking peacekeeping in particular countries. But if we want to advance a food security agenda, which hasn't had high-level support, being able to make the case that advancing the food security agenda may have important payoffs in other arenas that frankly interest high-level policymakers a little bit more than what do the time series on real food prices look like. That's the incentive for us to take on this project. And the real reason that matters is The core story of the book is that it's not urban food price riots that are the real danger. The real danger surrounds the sometimes seemingly innocuous policy responses by governments, by firms, by not-for-profits in response to growing food insecurity. That the measures that people take trying to address the immediate needs of their own populations or their clients, depending upon which sort of agent you're talking about, that those policy responses can cause food insecurity, at least in other populations or over time, and sow the seeds of some of the unrest that we're particularly worried about. So the policymakers are paying attention, and we need to make sure that they appreciate that their policy choices are ultimately an enormous part of deciding whether there will or will not be sociopolitical instability in response to the growing supply-demand imbalances in the global food system. So that's what this collection of papers is all about. I highlight Chris Blattman kindly contributed a nice endorsement blurb on the cover. So this volume is all about that, and here are the chapters. It's broken up into thematic chapters and geographic chapters with a couple of initial overviews. Mark Rosegrant and his colleagues at IFPRI have kind of the workhorse model of the global food economy, and Mark and a co-author contributed a very nice global overview chapter on climate. Thematic chapters including a very nice freshwater resources one by Manu, and geographic chapters by another set of very skilled authors. So that's the composition of the book. What I now want to do is just describe to you kind of the four basic pathways that collectively these chapters outline. These pathways don't have equal weight across regions. Some have much more bite in Latin America or in sub-Saharan Africa than in South Asia, for example. They don't pertain equally to each of the thematic areas. But the beauty of this project was that as we gathered a lot of experts, each talking about their particular area of expertise, common threads began to emerge very clearly. And that story is actually a core narrative of the upcoming national security estimate on food security. So the four main pathways. The first is the one that excited the intelligence community to launch this project to begin with, and that is the relationship between food price spikes and urban unrest. Spontaneous sociopolitical instability is almost exclusively an urban phenomenon. You don't really see this happen. You don't see people taking to the cornfields to protest high food prices. So it's just not something that happens. It's an urban phenomenon as people protest higher prices of staple foods, bread, tortillas, etc. It's important here to note that much of the media makes the inappropriate suggestion that high food prices, because they aggravate poverty, ignite urban food security. Now, it is certainly true that high food prices can aggravate poverty because food is the single largest item in the budget set of poor consumers. And as you double food prices but you don't increase people's income, you're obviously making them worse off in real terms. There were flawed but famous estimates coming out of the World Bank that the food price shock of 2008 increased the number of poor by the equivalent of the past 20 years worth of poverty reductions policies. So that 1 year's worth of food price spike undid a generation's work of anti-poverty programming. Turned out to be a bit of an exaggeration, but the qualitative point remains. It's a very real phenomenon. It's also true that high food prices are causally associated with urban unrest, food price riots. But that common correlation does not mean that it's the poverty increasing effect of high food prices that's driving people into the streets. And this is an important thing to keep in mind because the best available evidence is that most of the people taking to the streets are what in their context are very much the working class. And in particular, the high food prices are a symbol to a group of already somewhat disaffected persons of the abrogation of a social contract by their government. There are pre-existing grievances. There are grievances caused by the failure to maintain employment programs. Young men who've gotten educated and can't find jobs are the preponderance of the population taking to the streets in riots where anybody bothers to document who's on the streets. So the high food prices mobilize an already agitated underlying population. That's not necessarily the poor, certainly not the people who suffer the most severe nutritional effects from high food prices, because that would mean you'd have toddlers and elderly or very ill people taking to the streets, and that's clearly not the case. The people who suffer most biophysically from sudden shortfalls in nutrient intake are the most physically vulnerable people, and they're not the ones who are rioting on the streets. But the key thing here is this underscores that food plays a very powerful psychosocial role in the body politic in developing countries, especially in historically agrarian countries. Food is a fabric of relationships. And when food prices spike, this is threatening relationships. And in particular, this signals that the relationship between the state and its population is perhaps not as fruitful and as functional a relationship as people would like. So these price spikes are dangerous mainly where an opposition can galvanize already aggrieved subpopulations to join them and topple a government. Places like Haiti, this can happen. Not because of the food price spikes, those are the straw that breaks the camel's back, but because there's already so many reasons to have grievances with the government. So collectively, the contributors to this volume emphasize that these food price spikes really are a severe danger and governments need to attend to them. But the key to successful food price spike management is social safety nets. So countries that had standing large-scale transfer programs and other large-scale safety net programs did not appear on that roster, that graphic of countries that suffered deadly food price riots. Very strong correlation between places that had standing, effective, large-scale safety net programs that could cushion people when they suffer this sort of shock, and places that suffered food riots. So the importance of a safety net, of social protection programs, is clearly underscored here, and somewhat ironically, perhaps best underscored in the Latin America chapter. This is a reason why sometimes you need low-grade sociopolitical instability, why you need opposition movements who are willing to agitate against government peacefully to push the government to do things it might not be willing to do otherwise. Latin America did not suffer the same sort of sociopolitical disruptions during the food price spike of 2008 and 2011 as Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia did. In part, the contributors of that Latin America chapter argue, because they had a strong social movements tradition. Places like Brazil, Mexico, etc., the governments got pushed by opposition civil society groups to implement large-scale conditional cash transfer programs, child feeding programs, etc., that helped to diffuse some of the pressure. And those programs expanded substantially during the food price spikes and took a lot of the political pressure out of the system. So the existence of these important safety nets is a really key feature to understanding what helps to explain where food price spikes translate into violence and where they don't. And not always programs that governments are eager to undertake because they can expose the fiscal purse quite a bit, but terribly important investment. The most important pathway that worried the contributors to this volume was the pathway I mentioned before about the induced increase in the value of valuable natural resources, so land, water, genetic material, and that the induced competition for now more valuable resources is commonly poorly managed. It's taking place in areas where governments exert relatively little control. And when they do exert control, it's often done in ways that are somewhat capricious and lend themselves to further grievance. That because government just goes in and willy-nilly assigns land rights to a foreign investor and kicks people off the land, that doesn't mean it's really got good control. That often is just sowing the seeds of future unrest. So the biggest concern that comes up repeatedly across the geographic chapters and across several of the thematic chapters, including those on water, on land, etc., is the potential of this competition to spin out of control if it's not carefully managed through a widely agreed, just, fair, and reasonably transparent set of allocative mechanisms so that people understand who gets land and who doesn't, who gets water and who doesn't, and that this is reasonably efficiently allocated. Manu does a very nice job, for example, of documenting how in India there's actually quite a lot of water available, if it were allocated reasonably efficiently and fairly. But many of the problems that we see arise from rather poor mechanisms for the allocation of scarce resources and the reallocation when you face new pressures. And the problem there is that you get these distributional questions that arise, and they get settled largely through the exercise of power. That commonly mutates into not just a shock or a redistributive moment like you get from a food price shock, but it sows the seeds of underlying rebellion, especially in rural areas where governments have a much harder time of controlling these things than they do in urban areas. And they're, like food price shocks, exploitable by pre-existing opposition movements. The most dangerous forms of instability induced by the food price shocks, but not the fastest to emerge, are those that are occurring in rural areas. Lest this all sound really depressing and scary, there's a third really important pathway that gets highlighted repeatedly in this volume, and that is the opportunity to relieve the pressure. To relieve the pressure in the same way that we did in the post-war decades, through technological change, through accelerating supply growth so that it can again begin keeping up with demand growth and help to keep real food prices from rising further, maybe even begin to bring them back down. And that through wise strategic investment in agricultural R&D, through wise strategic investment in distribution systems, because it's not just about how much gets produced at farm gate, it's equally about how effectively can one get food to increasingly urbanized populations. The rapid growth in the marketing channel as people are increasingly physically removed from farms is a crucial challenge in the 21st century food systems of the developing world. But the opportunity to improve technologies, to improve technical efficiency, to expand supply, help bring down real food prices, and to expand production without intensifying the competition for resources is the big opportunity that exists. Now, there are some challenges in there, not least of which those due to genetically modified organisms, that the political and cultural competitions around GM food is a huge issue. The developing world now has more acreage in genetically modified crops than the high-income world does. As of last year, there's now more acreage under GM product in the developing world than the OECD countries. But, and this is a crucial but, most of it's cotton. The food crops are still not being cultivated using genetically modified technologies that are available. There is no country in Africa that has open release genetically modified food crops today, even though there's widespread cultivation of BT cotton, for example. Why? Well, largely because of political debates around biosafety, human health, etc. These are important scientific debates, but right now the competition, the political competition around GM is sort of trumping the scientific debate about GM, I would argue. This is a real issue moving forward in some of the places that people like Cheryl and I worry about a lot. The growing disparity in the rates of technical change in agriculture is a very big problem. So we see rapid growth in agricultural productivity in places like Brazil in particular, China to a lesser extent. China has its own problems in that China, as the title of the China chapter provocatively says, China's running out of farmers. China is about to go through a migration, rural to urban migration of something on the order of 250 to 400 million people in the coming 20 years. A historically unprecedented migration of people within one country from rural to urban areas. And that has all kinds of implications for how you actually farm. When suddenly you go from being labor abundant to labor scarce, and you can't really quickly develop the necessary machinery, especially in steeply sloped areas. So there are some real challenges of technological change that are sitting before us, including in places that we've seen growing quite quickly in agricultural productivity. But the real challenge is in the places that have the fastest growth in food demand, but aren't enjoying rapid technological change in agriculture, not rapid total factor productivity growth, sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So that more than 90% of the growth in world food demand over the coming 20 years will be in Africa and Asia. It's not going to happen in Europe and North America or Australia. And so because roughly 90% of the world's food consumption comes from commodities grown in the country in which it's consumed, you have to worry about local food production. And you have to worry about matching supply growth to the places where we see the demand growth. And that is disproportionately Africa and Asia. And as we've seen disinvestment from the global agricultural R&D system, that impact is being felt quite directly in Africa and Asia. That's not to say technological change is a magic bullet. It's not. The Green Revolution introduced a whole host of different problems. But it's a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition. Again, we emphasize in the book the importance of safety nets and social protection measures for the people who inevitably don't benefit directly from technological change. But without accelerated supply growth in agriculture, it's very hard to imagine a good scenario. The beautiful thing is governments, foundations, private businesses, NGOs can do something about that. So in small projects or in large-scale programs can do something to accelerate technological change and productivity growth in agriculture, whether it's through germplasm, through water management, through soils management, through livestock, through improved marketing systems that reduce post-harvest loss, etc. There are lots of things one can do. The fourth pathway is policy interventions. Now, some of those policy interventions are palliative and very helpful, like safety nets that I've emphasized several times. But some are dangerous not because they directly do harm, although there are things like export bans that are very expressly beggar thy neighbor policies. I stop exporting grain from Ukraine. That drives up wheat prices because Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya were the primary customers of the Ukrainian and Russian wheat exporters, and their supplies were disrupted substantially in 2010 and 2011. This had a direct role in the problems of bread availability, wheat flour availability in North Africa in the 2011 Arab Spring. So make no mistake, export bans get felt. They get felt heavily outside of the banning country's borders. But most policy measures don't have that sort of very obvious, nearly immediate adverse effect, adverse spillover effect. The real danger of something like buffer stock policies is that they induce further complacency among policymakers. Policymakers feel like we've invested in doing something about this, but a buffer stock program does nothing to augment supply. It just rearranges who holds the stocks. And that is an important thing to keep in mind, because the time and fiscal resources devoted to any sort of action are in direct competition with the other actions available to governments. And so a punchline of this book is that governments need to be very careful, and foundations and even firms that are invested in this space need to be very careful about what sorts of measures they take and where they invest their very scarce high-level decision-maker time and where they invest their scarce investable financial resources. If they invested in things like buffer stock creation and management, trade policies that create temporary barriers that are merely redistributive across space or time, they don't solve the underlying supply-demand imbalance problem that is behind the real food price increases that led people to take to the streets and are putting pressure on the productive resources underneath agriculture. That's where the attention needs to be. The underlying hypothesis of this volume, that food insecurity can lead to sociopolitical instability that threatens governments and that should be of interest to governments and civil society throughout the world, that hypothesis seems reasonable. There's growing evidence, albeit not evidence that we can lock down with 95% confidence, satisfying usual scientific standards for statistical tests. But that evidence is growing really by the week. And this evidence adds to the logic to invest in agriculture and to invest in broader food systems, including the distributive systems to get food from production areas to cities and the social protection programs necessary to ensure the nutrition of vulnerable populations. And the focus here has to be on Africa and Asia, because that's where the demand growth is happening, and the root issue here is demand-supply growth imbalance. Looking forward, as Manu says, I'm an optimist by nature. He learned that. We'd have long conversations playing squash when we were at Utah State, and he'd sometimes shake his head and say, you just are optimistic in the face of incredible evidence that you shouldn't be sometimes. I really do believe that we can and will solve this problem. But a crucial part to solving that problem is recognizing that this is, at root, a demand-supply imbalance issue. And that just as that problem was solved in the wake of World War II through strategic investments in agricultural R&D that led to steadily and sharply declining real food prices over 2 generations and a Nobel Peace Prize, we have to understand that we have to confront the same sorts of challenges today, but in a more complex environment. Because the intellectual property regimes are more complicated, we're facing growing evidence of climate change that can be seriously disruptive. We face a world in which macroeconomic stress in the OECD countries is much bigger and will surely limit how much the major donor countries are willing to contribute. So it's a more challenging environment than was faced in the 40s, 50s, 60s. But if we don't meet this challenge, we've got very real problems ahead of us. So we don't really have an option here. This is a challenge that simply has to be met. The good news is that high-level policymakers are beginning to internalize that lesson. What they're a little slower on internalizing, frankly, is the message that it has to be in Africa and Asia. You still have a lot of America will feed the world sort of rhetoric out there, that if we just invest in better soy and corn production in the Midwestern United States, we'll take care of the problems. I think that's a rather naive, dangerously naive view of how to tackle this problem. But the good news is people are paying attention to agriculture again. The means by which you achieve food security is the key issue. As discussed, we need to be careful about diverting attention to low productivity ventures that don't wind up substantially accelerating supply growth and improving access for the poorer populations of the developing world. The biggest returns are going to come through productivity investments and social protection programs. Conversely, food security achieved through measures that have adverse spillover effects, like intellectual property grabs, like land grabs, like export bans. Those are the measures that can actually aggravate problems, unfortunately. So I thank you for your time and interest. I look forward to hearing what Mark and Manu have to add. I encourage you to take a look at their chapters. The book is available electronically through Oxford University Press. I understand the first print run has sold out now. They're reprinting this week. But if you're interested, it is available electronically. I'm sure Columbia's library has access to it.
That was incredible summary of a long and very varied book with a great deal of information in it. I'm not going to rehash what was in the chapter that I wrote, but I'm going to talk a little bit about an example of a place where I think that climate variability has influenced conflict, and that's Syria, and extend a bit the framework that Chris had established. And in particular, what I would want to say is that the focus of much of what he said, and it's just part of what's in the book, was about food price spikes and urban unrest. And if we look at Syria, we can go a little bit back in time to how that kind of urban unrest comes about. One thing I would emphasize is one of the elements he talked about in the discussion of food spikes and urban price spikes and urban unrest was the psychosocial impact of food prices, and the fact that part of it, and the way I would phrase it, would be that people who are working class, middle class, become, if you want, a little bit nervous. The social compact is threatened. Not that they're starving yet, and not that they will starve, but their notions of stability are threatened, and that is very unsettling. Okay. If I take this into a rural situation, and I'll use Syria as an example, what happened in Syria was that there was an extensive drought from 2005 to 2010. And in particular, the years roughly in the middle of that period, 6, 7, 8, were the worst droughts probably we have in the recorded record. Okay, and in addition to the fact that there's food shortages resulting from that, what happens is that people who are farming give up after a time. Maybe not after 1 year of drought, maybe not after 2, But after 3 years of drought, those are the people, the rural agricultural communities, move en masse to the cities because it simply becomes unsupportable to farm. And so it's, in effect, another and more severe psychosocial impact. These are the people then who are on the outskirts of the cities and are most subject to the fact that they live in a place where the government essentially doesn't provide any services. Okay, so as Chris was emphasizing, there are a lot of, let's call them preformed complaints about the way the government acts. Then you get to, a period where food shortages are severe and the riots break out. So that in Syria, the main urban unrest was in 2011. Essentially, this is lagging behind the period where a large part of the rural population, perhaps 1.5 million people, moved from no longer tenable farmland to the cities. And, it was there that essentially created the kind of urban population that was so vulnerable to high food prices and so resentful of a lack of government services. In this case, it's not just food prices, but there are other aspects of moving 1.5 million people to urban peripheries that have not food, but no other services, was disastrous. So I just wanted to add to the general framework he had, the notion that one of the things that climate and other forces, but climate can contribute to this mix of problems, is the fact that you disrupt rural societies that were stable in place, that had provided social support networks in the communities that were perhaps not so dependent directly on the government, okay? And then these people are forced to leave the land, they move to the cities, and they are dependent on the government that is not able to provide for them or not willing to provide for them. And I think I'll just leave it there.
Taking a cue from Mark, going to personal stories of some sort, I guess. When Chris first talked to me about this volume and to think about these issues, my first reaction was that if you actually go far back into Asian societies or perhaps into the Middle East and Europe as well, the role of the emperor was to gather and store grain so that in times of exigency you could redistribute it. So there was a fundamental system at play, which is what what you can think of in terms of the responsibilities of the government. So that's kind of interesting to keep in mind because governments or emperors were overthrown when they failed to actually meet that particular obligation. So that's what came to mind. And then I started looking at it from the water lens and reviewing the large numbers of papers that were devoted to whether or not we have enough water to produce enough food for 9 billion people. And most of them think we cannot. And the conclusion I came to was a bit weird because most of the models these people used assumed productivity higher than what we saw in the field with respect to land and water. And you assumed efficiencies that were also lower than higher than what I was seeing in the field. And yet when you started looking into things in detail, one of the things that jumped out was that by and large, the assumptions most people were making were that you should grow certain crops where they are grown today. And what we discovered as we played a few games with this was that really, if you allowed yourself the flexibility of a global food system that was geared to meet nutritional requirements and optimized with respect to where each crop should really be grown, assuming there were no social restrictions, then the game changed radically. So that one policy measure, it seemed like was a good play. Then we started looking at issues with regard to what are the major factors that could lead to the kind of situations that were a problem. And just as Chris showed, it was the spike because of a certain set of circumstances in the last 5 years that led to the hike in prices. Now, if you think about it, there were two determinants there that come to mind. One was we had fairly large stocks for a while. Prices were low, so the incentives to increase production were limited to certain places. Second, in terms of food storage, which is the reason I gave the example of the empires of the past, investments in food storage were consistently limited, again, because prices are low. And for a water person, this was interesting because water is not priced at all. And so the big efforts that were made to store water post-Second World War, same story as with agriculture, had basically disappeared. Most of the dams that are out there on the planet to store water to deal with climate buffering were built between 1950 and 1980. There's been very little happening after that. And the same sort of story plays out in food storage. So to summarize my comments, I guess what is interesting that comes out is that there is a responsibility the governments of the world assume with regard to food and its production, water, energy, and other aspects. And the complacency that Chris talked about emerged because the pressure on these governments to continue to fulfill these things, looking forward, say 10, 20 years was not there because the current situation was good and prices were low. So the investment potential was then not seen as significant. Coupled with that, there are a couple of other sociological things that I think have happened, and this is the debate between big and small, and we see that in the water world. There are very few people today who think that dams should be built, especially big dams, because of their disruptive environmental influence. They advocate building small storages, working with rain-fed systems, and so forth, but when you examine those critically, you find that they have their own set of negative consequences, which can be as substantial as building a few large dams. Similarly, in the food system production, people debate whether large-scale food production or smallholder farmers are the problem, and which one can actually effectively do different things. I think these are issues that need to be thought through and resolved. There's not going to be a binary answer to them. There's going to be a mix of things that have to be resolved there. And the economics, of course, will play a role. But the biggest thing that we've established in the work we've looked at is that it's the political systems and their negative impacts through efforts to doing good that are the biggest problem that needs to be unraveled. And that, I think, is the challenge that may prevent us from getting where we need to be. But otherwise, from a technological perspective, I don't think that there's really that much of a problem getting to where we need to be.
So I guess we have time for questions and comments for any of the three of us. Yes, please.
I'm Chuck Samuel. I'm a graduate of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences and Columbia University. And there was a lot of talk, it was very focused on international, but nothing said about domestic stability. And while I believe it's unlikely that we would have a revolution in the United States that would, or riots in the street, we certainly have proven that we can screw up the Farm Bill over the past few months. So I'm just curious as to where you see stability, food stability in the United States being impacted by our own political inactivity or bad policy for corn ethanol or whatever.
Great and difficult question in the sense that the Farm Bill has never been pretty. It's arguably even uglier today than it has been in the past. Whether that is really due to anything changing in the agricultural and food systems in the United States is an open debate, or whether it's just broader problems in our body politic. But there is a very interesting dimension to the past 5 years' high food price regimes that has clearly entered into the Farm Bill debates. So keep in mind that our current Farm Bill was enacted in 2008. and basically negotiated in 2006, 2007, before food prices began rapidly increasing. So the last Farm Bill of 2008 was largely set when food prices were low. It's also important to keep in mind that the WTO Doha round negotiations and all the parameters around negotiations around agricultural trade liberalization were launched at the moment in which real food prices hit an all-time low. So we're now negotiating around a WTO. There's a ministerial coming up later this month. We're trying to hammer out a farm bill. But the basic points of departure were set in a radically different regime in which food prices were low, and the concern was to support farmers, to prevent there from being barriers to imports that would compete with farmers, because farming was such a difficult business to be in. And again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, this year, U.S. agriculture will see profits higher than in any year in recorded history. So just for inflation, and you still have record profits for the farm sector in the U.S. this year. The issue is not the profitability of agriculture. And take away the food stamps issues that are unfortunately an enormous part of the farm bill debate in the United States. Just around the agricultural programs, what we see is it's harder to support direct payments to farmers because farmers are frankly rolling in money. I mean, I live in a town in which there are more cows than people. I don't even live in Ithaca. I live in a little town north of Ithaca. And the farm community there will tell you they struggle, but the times are still pretty good. There's not a lot of effort to try to support direct payments. Instead, the argument is things have become volatile. Prices move quickly. Climate is a real problem. So the programs that are expanding are the agricultural insurance programs. There's basically a recapitalization of direct payments into insurance programming that ultimately increases the net transfers from taxpayers to U.S. farmers, if anything resembling either the House or Senate bills were to go through. And this is directly a byproduct of the regime, the change in the global food price regime we've seen, as well as the sorts of climate volatility pressures that are here as well as in Syria. Not as egregious here, thankfully. So you're absolutely right. This is definitely changing the political debate and changing the technical parameters around the Farm Bill. It's also posing real problems for the WTO ministerial because they don't, frankly, know how to negotiate around limiting export side interventions other than export subsidies. But that's increasingly the issue in agriculture, is putting restrictions on government's capacity to limit exports from their countries. Wasn't on the table with the Doha round, and we don't know how to get it on the table very effectively right now. So these changes have a very real impact on the OECD countries and agricultural policies here. Thankfully, we don't really need to worry about riots in the streets or government overthrow because of agriculture, but we do need to worry about radical changes in policy that result from these underlying pressures and changes that aren't necessarily heading in the right direction. Yes, please.
I have two questions. The first one goes off of that one about how prices have increased, and so there's a lot of people suffering, but there's probably also some benefits that have come from this. I mean, USAID and these development organizations have been trying to put money in the hands of agricultural farmers, for decades, and so what are some of the benefits? I know we've been talking about the consequences, but what are the benefits? And then the second one is, since you are familiar with sub-Saharan Africa, have you looked at the correlation between the conflict in Mali, the recent 2012 conflict in Mali, and food prices there?
Let me take those in reverse order. Attributing any specific episode of violence to something like food prices is a rather cavalier endeavor. I wouldn't say that the conflict in Mali is due to high food prices. At the same time, it's not entirely accidental that the long-standing political opposition, the secessionist movement in northern Mali, really started to gain much more support in key urban areas as populations in some of those urban areas felt the government had largely abandoned them as food prices, especially coarse grains prices, spiked. Keep in mind, 2011, the food price spike was around wheat, and Malians have increasingly come to consume wheat, especially urban Malians, as you've seen a rapid increase in wheat imports into the Sahelian countries. And the primary grains produced in Mali, coarse grains, are pretty ready substitutes with wheat and with maize. Maize prices spiked, but not nearly as much in 2012. So there were very real urban food price pressures felt in Mali that definitely fed into this underlying, long-standing opposition over entirely different reasons. So is it reasonable to conjecture that that was another straw that broke a camel's back? Yeah, I think that's a quite reasonable conjecture. Is it the driver? Certainly not. There are other bigger reasons. Who benefits from higher food prices? Well, those who are net suppliers of food. It's a fairly automatic connection. The key there is, what's the distribution of this? How large is that population? One thing that many people, including many economists regrettably, don't fully grasp, because we talk about food as a consumption good, and then we talk about farming as if all farmers are merely food-producing firms, but not also food-consuming households. Most farmers in Africa are actually net food buyers. So in Africa, you have this strange phenomenon that, at least in the short run, before they have the chance to change crops, to expand the area they cultivate, to do any of a variety of things to try to increase their production in response to market signals, in the short run, most African farmers actually suffered from the high food prices, which is a curious thing to non-specialists because it sounds entirely counterintuitive. The key is to remember they're food consumers as well as food producers, and they actually make up the deficit between their consumption and production through off-farm labor. So about 70% of African farmers work outside the farm, and they have to do that to be able to afford to buy food for their families during the gap. So who benefits? Well, it tends to be a rather small group of rather large farmers in the developing world. Places like Brazil did pretty well from the food price spike. Brazil, as many of you will know, is a major agricultural exporter and the fastest growing food exporter in the world, or fastest growing food exports in the world, I should say, and a predominantly large holder food production system. So Brazilian farmers overwhelmingly did pretty well. Not all, but overwhelmingly did pretty well, while, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, most farmers don't produce enough of a surplus to have benefited. Now, the interesting thing is that donors have talked a lot about their efforts to help smallholders. But when you look at the numbers, the dollars invested, you said that for years AID has been investing in agriculture. Well, actually, AID's portfolio in agriculture shrunk from being something on the order of 45% of their total non-administrative expenses, so take out staff and travel and all that sort of stuff. And about 45% of total non-administrative expenses by USAID in 1980 were on agriculture. And by the year 2005, it was down to about 10%. So we've not been investing in agriculture. We've been disinvesting from agriculture. There's been a lot of rhetoric about agriculture, but there's been very little actual investment. And it's really important to keep track of which is which. Now, there has been a ramping up of investment in agriculture, not just through AID, but also through some of the other agencies. So the Feed the Future program, some of you are familiar with, has significantly increased the administration's investments in agriculture, and the Congress has largely gone along with that. But we're still nowhere close to the 1980 levels, for example. So we still are far below where we were in the heyday in which the US government was investing in developing country agriculture. We have seen African governments begin to recommit themselves to investment through something called the CADEP program, by which African heads of states agreed to a minimum floor for investment in agricultural R&D and extension services, targeted especially to smallholder producers and reaching more remote producing areas. And several states have really stepped up to the plate and have met or exceeded those targets, but many haven't. Most haven't. And even then, the targets are pretty low. And one of the problems you face in Africa is that places like Columbia and Cornell are no longer producing PhD level scientists to go back and staff their agricultural research institutes and to advise their ministers of agriculture and trade. So the human capital, the high level scientific human capital capacity of sub-Saharan African countries is severely eroded relative to what it was back in the 70s and 80s today, which is really discouraging as you think about who's advising the finance minister as the finance minister is compelled to double his investment in agriculture. Just because they're spending more doesn't necessarily mean they're spending better. And we have to be very careful about assuming that more is always better in equal proportion to the increase in dollars spent. It's not. And I personally have a lot of worries about how the increased agricultural investments in sub-Saharan Africa are taking place. Yes, please, sir.
Tony Coleman here at the SDSN. Can I take us back to the Farm Bill and the issue of food aid to sub-Saharan Africa? I know that I think the President and the Democrats are trying to get food aid be given in money to the World Food Programme so the food can be bought locally where there is a food spike or a food problem. But there is a reticence to stop the policy intervention, Pathway 4, which has wrecked, my words, many African farmers' plans by having a situation where they are having, for long periods of time, way after the time of the drought or the food spike, having US food brought into their country, often on a 3 to 5 year cycle, which almost destroys the local farming community. Could you say whether, as part of your advice you have given to the National Intelligence Agency, is to strongly recommend that food aid, as has been done by the European Union, is actually a financial contribution to the World Food Programme to support farmers locally, to support those who are suffering from the food spike locally?
Great question, and another one of my incarnations. I actually spend a lot of time getting beaten up about U.S. food aid policy. So let me clear up a couple of important misconceptions in your statement with which I largely agree. I'm a very strong advocate for relaxing the unnecessary congressional restrictions on U.S. food aid. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, U.S. food aid as we know it today was largely enacted in 1954 as a way of offloading government-held surpluses generated by farm price support programs. And because we were buying up, as a buyer of last resort, commodities in the United States, we necessarily had to ship it from the United States. And if we're doing that, why not put it on U.S. flag vessels and get some kind of double benefits because we help maintain merchant marine capacity? The problem with that is that U.S. farm price supports ended in the 1990s. But this way of doing business for food aid, that we would buy in the United States, ship from the United States, and that was the only way we were allowed to do it, has remained and creates a real problem. This is the same way that the Europeans, the Canadians, the Australians did it as well. The difference is that they all unbundled this, what's called tying of food aid. Well, the Europeans did it in the late 1990s, or started doing it in the late 1990s. Everybody else has done it over the past 15 years. But we continue to have a strict Buy American provision in U.S. food aid authorization legislation. Now that has two effects. It's expensive because it costs us. We spend only 40 cents of every appropriated dollar on commodities. The Canadians, by contrast, spend 70 cents of every dollar on commodities. The difference is shipping costs and unnecessary administrative expense, largely due to the complexity of running a program that buys in the United States to ship it halfway around the world, and in some cases turn around and sell it at 70 cents on the dollar. So it's an express money-losing proposition. So it's incredibly cost ineffective. The second, and arguably biggest problem, is it's incredibly slow. The median time for delivery of U.S. emergency food aid is just under 5 months. Emergency food aid, that's not long-standing project food aid to support school feeding programs where you know 12 months ahead of time that you need deliveries, and so it doesn't matter that you don't rush it. This is emergency food aid. It takes 5 months because we have to buy it in the United States. Now, we can do better. The Europeans, Canadians, Australians have all been doing that for a long time. What people don't often recognize is the United States has actually become the world's largest provider of cash-based food aid, because we do it outside of the authorized and appropriated food aid system. We do it using international disaster assistance money. The problem is that money is limited and it runs out. If the typhoon had hit the Philippines in September instead of November, the US government would not have had any money to respond, because we had exhausted our IDA accounts on Syria by the last week of September, and we had no authorization to buy locally. So the response, the massive response that emergency operations are undertaking in Philippines in response to the typhoon, sourced predominantly with US food aid today, is just the dumb luck of when the typhoon hit on the calendar, which is crazy. Local and regional procurement, so there's a special issue of a journal just out in September documenting very carefully that local and regional procurement reduces delivery lags by on average 14 weeks. And for basic grains, cuts costs by about 55%. It saves time, it saves money, therefore it saves lives, and it reduces the budgetary burden. Why? So the first important thing to clear up is that the United States doesn't do this. The United States does it massively, but it has to do an end run around the Congress. Because the Congress, in food aid authorization legislation under the Farm Bill, says you have to buy in the United States and ship from the United States, and half of it has to be on US flagged vessels. So USAID just finds workarounds. But it does, on massive scale, to their great credit. The problem is the Congress doesn't do it. Now, it's not a Democrats proposing the reforms thing. So George Bush was the first president to propose reforming the food aid system. Barack Obama has proposed very, very similar reforms, and it has fallen because of bipartisan opposition. So a pox on both houses here. It's interesting, the coalitions that emerge, and they're driven largely by the shipping interests. They're not driven by agribusiness anymore. Cargill came out in support of President Obama's proposals. They're not driven by the farmers. The National Farmers Union came out in support of Obama's food aid reform proposals. They're not driven by the NGOs, some of which oppose this because it threatens a primary revenue stream for them where they monetize food aid. They sell it on open markets when they receive it. But the food aid reforms are supported by most of the large food aid NGOs. The group that is uniform in its opposition are the shippers. And most people don't even know that they're out there on this issue because they're a small group. In the shadows, it's not obvious. You'd think that maritime interests are the people behind food aid policy, but they are. And the unions in the maritime industry rally the Democratic side, and the ship owners rally the Republican side, and together they've provided a very effective political obstacle. It's a very curious thing. I finally achieved some respect about my research from my children because in September I appeared on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart talking about this issue of maritime opposition to food aid. And they made a wonderful spoof out of the people threatened by food aid reform are the poor shippers. But it's the reality. They're the real opposition. Now, the one other point that I do want to clear up about your statement is that food aid is disruptive and damages farming communities. That once was perhaps true when the US government and other governments would dump our farm surpluses in these developing countries in a fairly wanton way through old-fashioned government-to-government food aid shipments. But that's not how food aid is done today. Food aid today is overwhelmingly emergency response directly distributed to people directly affected by disasters. And the marginal effects on food prices of food distribution are very modest at best. And the effects on farming populations are once you get proper controls out there for the fact that there are common drivers to food aid coming into an area and to farming collapsing in an area, like a drought that induces a food aid inflow and causes the collapse of the farming system. Once you get proper controls in place for that, the best estimates that we can generate are that food aid actually has a palliative effect on especially smallholder production because it enables smallholders to do things like not eat their seed. It enables them to do things like not have to spend the scarce cash they've got on food to feed their families, but instead to spend it on fertilizer, hiring workers, and buying seed. So well-targeted, quickly delivered food aid, which is the predominant form today, is, if anything, a stimulus to smallholder agricultural systems. It wasn't always true, but it's really important to update for the fact the system has changed dramatically. Sorry for the very long-winded answer to a simple question.
Sorry. Sorry.
So what has changed over time? In 1990, I won't get the number exactly right, but something on the order of 60% of global food aid is what was called program food aid, a government-to-government transfer in kind. It's basically a gift that came in the form of bags of wheat or non-fat dried milk powder that was used for budgetary support. Most governments use that either for school feeding programs or for food subsidy programs for urban populations, or more commonly, they just dumped it on the local market. They sold the shipment from the United States with wanton disregard to food markets and what effect this would have on farmers, and then used the fiscal cash resource that resulted from the sales proceeds for whatever they needed in budgetary purposes. Food aid, program food aid is done. It ended in the George Bush administration. The Europeans ended it around 1999, 2000. Canada ended it a long time ago. The only program food aid out there today is a very small volume of rice shipments from Japan to circumvent the WTO agreements. The Uruguay Round Agreement on Agriculture requires that Japan import rice, but the Japanese don't particularly want to import rice. So they dutifully import it, and they move it from one vessel to the next and send it right back out as a gift to rice importing countries. That is the only program food aid that exists today. So the program food aid that was the workhorse in 1990, much less before that, today is zero, effectively. It's all emergency response except for a little bit of project food aid that's largely for maternal child health programs and school feeding programs. So it's a completely different food assistance world today than it was 20, 25 years ago. Unfortunately, the political discourse doesn't update for that. Yes, please, in the back.
As the developing world becomes more developed, there's obviously a correlation between the growth of institutional funds roaming the planet for investments, mutual funds and what have you. And I've been watching peripherally the price of farmland in the Midwest of the United States. And so as you know, irregardless of the government programs, the institution of pure finance and investment are coming in and we're driving up the price of farmland. So, and I came late, always a late student. If you touched it, fine, but if you haven't, could you give us a little bit of an explanation on how do you see roaming large tranches of institutional, pure capitalistic money buying up the land? And on that same perspective, it begs up my ghetto school mind, that it begs the question, a philosophical question, of the fact that China owns all the land in the land. And we are working with a capitalistic system in which money can come in. So there might be a discussion philosophically of 100 years from now, particularly given that there was an observation of ancient societies and governance controlling the food supply, et cetera, what's going to be the mixture of government versus capitalistic owning of land as you're dealing with food shortages?
I won't hazard going into large-scale systems philosophy, but your observation about massive investment in farmland is a really important one. Just out of curiosity, can I have a show of hands? How many of you have investments in TIAA-CREF? Okay, like a third to half the room are active participants in land grabs in developing country agriculture. TIAA-CREF is the second largest owner, institutional investor owner of farmland in the developing world. So most of you were unaware of that because most of us don't read our prospectus. I didn't know that until I read somebody write it up, and then I went back and checked because I actually have money in the TIAA-CREF real estate account, and I went and looked and was like, oh my God, they're right. So there is a massive flow of investment into farmlands in the developing world. In 2009, there was more land purchased in Africa than all the farmland of northwestern Europe combined. So draw a line from France through Denmark and everything northwest of that. That entire area was transacted in 1 year in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, it's really hard to appreciate the scale right now of farmland transactions in the developing world. This is heavily concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa and a few countries in Asia, to a lesser degree in Latin America. Lesser in Latin America because they're frankly more active land markets, and land undervaluation is less serious an issue there than it is in Africa and Asia, in some places in Asia. But what's driving this? Well, it's driven by largely sovereign wealth funds in countries that worry, for good reason, about access to reliable food in years ahead. Places like Korea, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states that have plenty of cash lying around aren't so sure that they will be able to count on being able to import food at reasonable prices 10 years from now, 20 years from now, so they've made precautionary investments that also happen to be reasonable financial investments in farmlands in the developing world. Those are the largest sources of external capital investment in agricultural lands in Africa. Is this an issue? It's an enormous issue. It's also an enormous opportunity. And the trick is how governments use this opportunity. It's an enormous opportunity because most of us believe that smallholder agriculture is seriously undercapitalized. I mean, all of you who give money through Kiva thinking that small loans to entrepreneurs in rural Africa or rural Asia are somehow going to make a difference, well, that pales in comparison to pumping millions or hundreds of millions of dollars at a time in to relieve capital constraints that really do limit smallholders' ability to take up productive technologies, that limit government's ability to rehabilitate irrigation or improve roads. So capital isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be a very good thing, where it resolves a binding constraint on productivity. The trick is that capital actually being put to good use to make the sorts of investments in productivity growth, or is it just essentially a call option on farmland? Klaus Deininger at the World Bank is probably the world's foremost expert on these land investments around the world. Klaus's most recent estimate, when I asked him about 2 weeks ago, was that right now only 15 to 20% of the land transacted between 2008 and 2010 in Africa, only about 15 to 20%, is actually in cultivation. The vast majority of it is just being held right now. So it's become inactive rather than active and more productive. And that's a real concern. The other big concern is the displacement effects. So if you have people who are cultivating these lands who are suddenly kicked off the lands because they didn't use it, the land was somehow inactive, which is a common claim of governments like the Madagascar government, like the Ethiopian government. There's no private land holding in Ethiopia. The government owns it all, but it grants leaseholds, life leaseholds to cultivators. Government can therefore kick people off. It's always had an active land redistribution program. And if people get kicked off the land and they don't feel justly compensated, they don't get a job on the land, they're basically forced to move, it becomes a population like the one Mark describes that's displaced for climatic reasons, not for investment reasons. But a large displaced population that feels aggrieved and not supported by the government is potentially a very dangerous thing. There's a big opportunity out there to tap global capital to accelerate investment and productivity growth in agriculture in relatively unproductive lands in Africa and Asia. But we need an institutional infrastructure that compels that capital to actually be channeled towards generating more investment on the land, more jobs for farm workers and post-harvest processors and truckers, et cetera. And right now that's not happening in many places. So right now I think it's something to be very worried about. But we need to be careful about overreacting and trying to shut down foreign direct investment in developing country agriculture because it desperately needs capital. The trick is figuring out how to channel it in a productive way. And I don't think we've got that worked out at all just yet. In the far back. We need water and climate questions.
Water question. Yeah. Just following on what you just said, it does beg the question, given that much, certainly in the countries we're concerned with, in the continents, much of the water is a common property resource. And hence, land grabs have an implication for water grabs too, and competition for water and displacement of small farmers, and because they lose their rights to the water, even those are customary rights and not legal property rights.
And the analog, for instance, some of you are probably aware of the massive discovery of aquifers in northwestern Kenya recently. Earlier this fall, a massive reservoir was discovered. Well, this is highly arid land, and seizing the water in the sense of you're the one who drills and now generates access to underground aquifers, that raises big questions about, well, what happens to the land? So we can, it can go either direction here, but the two clearly are closely coupled. And we have where we have clear tenurial regimes, they typically are around land. They're less typically around water, which is a much more complicated problem. The land doesn't move and the water does. This is a very real worry. It's not a coincidence that some of the most ferocious internal violence in Africa has been waged in areas that have a very serious competition for water. I mean, the Darfur conflict originates over a competition for water between agropastoralists and migratory pastoralists and cultivators. And we see episodes of that come up repeatedly in other places, other dry lands where water is the limiting resource. Governance over water is a really big issue. I don't frankly understand it very well, but it troubles me. Let me actually ask Manu's intervention, because he writes about this in his chapter.
I'm not sure that most people understand it either. The economists seem to come at it from a market perspective, which actually is not applicable at all to the situation that we see. The non-economists seem to fall in two categories: people who think that the state should exercise controls, and people who basically are looking at sustainability from some magical perspective, which eludes me, frankly. So the issue, I think, with the water allocation and water rights, you can partition it into two things. The linkage that was made here by you as well as Chris was the relationship to land. Now, if you're talking about the amount of water that falls as rain on the land, this is not really that easy to capture for most people, so that's not the issue. So typically this goes towards the groundwater that exists below the site, and people want to tap it. Even in the United States, the regulatory structure for what can be safely withdrawn from groundwater aquifers is pretty nebulous. Okay. When I lived in Utah, when I first moved there, I went and talked to the state engineer about the possibility of looking at groundwater management in northern Utah versus building the Central Utah project to divert Colorado River water for farming in Utah. And the response was, we can't even see this stuff. What are you talking about managing it? So that was 1982. And in 1998, just before I was moving to Columbia, the successor to that state engineer came over and said that it seems like we have allocated 3 times the number of permits for groundwater extraction that the USGS now estimates is the safe yield for this system. What should we do? And that's a question that is getting increasingly asked in other parts of the United States. If you look at the Northwest Kenya example, I was interviewed by an African TV station just when that news came out. And my response was, this is water that starts out at 200 meters deep. The cost of extraction of this, you can think about if you installed a hydropower installation at Lake Victoria, that will not generate a commensurate amount of energy as the energy required to extract this water per unit water. So think about that before people get excited about developing this. Maybe as a byproduct of oil extraction, if you could do this, that could be the case. And that's not what people are saying. But frankly, in that particular example, it's the oil that the land is being sought for, not the water. Because water is not getting priced. So if you look forward, how these issues can be solved, I think can only happen if a system of metering and pricing comes in. And that seems very simple, but the metering doesn't happen because the price being charged for the water is not enough to pay for the metering. It's a really convoluted situation across the world.
We have time for another final question or comment.
Hi, I'm really interested in the intersection of food and energy. I'm a graduate student here at the Earth Institute in the Sustainability Management Program. And so if you can maybe just comment on the land grab issue and how some of that is taken up by energy companies, especially in Asia, for maybe solar farm development or any type of energy development? Thanks.
Good question, and I don't know the data on the breakdown. I don't know the data on the breakdown of who are the investors, not least of which because it's hard to trace. Most foreign investors actually use a domestic partner as the registered investor with the national government. And so much of the work to try to identify how much foreign investment is actually flowing into land acquisitions in Africa and Asia is piecemeal and has a hard time identifying who really is the ultimate source of capital. That said, there are two different types of land investments taking place that are worth noting. One is, as you say, the investments to try to get renewable energy sources, whether it's solar or hydro. But the other is for biofuels. And there are significant investments in everything from cassava for biodiesel or jatropha for biodiesel to, in some cases, maize, even in maize consuming areas for ethanol production right now, as well as certainly sugar, cane sugar for ethanol production. The best we can tell is that those remain a relatively modest share of the overall investment. Again, only 15 to 20% of the agricultural lands acquired over the last 5 years seem to be in cultivation. A very small share of that is in biofuels feedstock production. How much of that is unused because people are exploring it for hydro and solar? I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that question, frankly. I would speculate that it's pretty small, though. The potential for solar and for hydro in sub-Saharan Africa, the region I know best, is considerable. Geothermal, perhaps even more. The big thing about hydro and geothermal is you don't necessarily have to invest in a lot of land to be able to tap that energy source. I think the real issues around energy and agriculture in the developing world are around the sourcing of liquid fuels. Because keep in mind that food is pretty cheap per unit weight. A huge part of the delivered cost of food is transport costs. Indeed, in recent unpublished work my group has, we find that food prices in interior markets in Africa respond more to global oil price shocks than they do to global food price shocks. Purely, and when we break it out so I can isolate pathways, it's very much a transport cost story. And keep in mind there are very few low-income countries that are oil producers. The liquid fuels these countries use are entirely imported. Indeed, they're commonly imported already in refined form. They're importing petrol directly, not importing crude and refining the petrol out of it. So the vulnerability to shocks in energy markets for food systems are considerable, especially as we increasingly urbanize our populations. And the food has to move from the rural area to the urban areas. The real vulnerability around energy and agriculture in the low-income world, especially in places like Africa where there are long distances and lousy infrastructure, is really around liquid fuels and how can we develop the capacity to produce liquid fuels within these countries using non-traditional means. Can we produce local biofuels at village scale or at town scale and not rely on massive petroleum refineries? Can we use crop byproducts, crop residues that can be turned into liquid fuels that can run on simple combustion engines to bring in inputs and evacuate surplus crop? Those are some of the really interesting technological challenges around energy and agriculture in the developing world now, and ripe for research by bright graduate students. Yeah, please, I guess one last one.
Could you discuss your information or beliefs on genetically modified food? And if they're bad or good, are they really needed because of the water and the climate change problems that will be coming, which is what Monsanto uses to defend what they're doing?
Yeah. So
the way you like.
Yeah, so to be very explicit, I'm a big believer in let's put every arrow in the quiver. I don't know of an agricultural technology that's unambiguously good. Monoculture maize, monoculture wheat have all kinds of problems when they don't use fertilizer and when they don't use genetically improved seed. Just because we cultivate something with traditional seed doesn't necessarily make it either environmentally or socially desirable. Genetically modified seed can be problematic. There really are issues of gene drift, and biosafety controls are very important parts of the introduction of genetically modified organisms into any agroecosystem. I don't really know any good scientist who thinks otherwise, frankly. The question is, do you just outright ban these? And one way to ask this question is to run the following thought experiment. Do you want your grandchildren to be able to eat bananas? Does anybody here not want their grandchildren to be able to eat bananas? I'm assuming those who don't have grandchildren who are already, kids 40 years from now. Well, if you don't allow for genetic modification, my grandchildren are not going to eat bananas, because banana is a vegetatively propagated crop that doesn't have any natural resistance to several viri that are seriously threatening banana in several parts of the world. And if we don't genetically modify banana, banana will be gone in my lifetime. Papaya went through exactly that threat, and the only thing that saved papaya from ring spot virus was the use of the gene gun to genetically modify the papaya genome, work done at Cornell, by the way, that saved the papaya industry in Hawaii and several other places when ring spot virus was running rampant and destroying entire plantations and about to destroy the industry. So you have papaya today because of genetically modified food crops. You will have banana in 40 years because of genetic modification. So if you accept that thought experiment, that those of us who like to have our fresh fruit salads in the middle of the northern winter should be able to do so, and you don't want your papaya and banana gone, well, why doesn't that apply to staple crops for poor populations in Africa too? Genetically modified seed isn't a magic bullet. It's not going to be the answer to everything, but it clearly is the answer to some things. Genetically modified cotton has substantially reduced post-harvest and on-farm yield losses for farmers in India, very carefully documented now. This is increasing profits for farmers in India. It's also associated with increased borrowing by Indian farmers and a variety of different problems people associate with that borrowing. It's not an uncontested area. But the kind of basic economics of what does it do to small farmer profitability is pretty hard to argue with today, for the simple reason that we basically have two kinds of genetic modification in field crops, two different genes, either for herbicide resistance or for resistance to bollworms and other predators that the BT is used to combating. And those two different pieces of genetic modification are very effective in places where farmers suffer very high yield losses because they don't use a lot of pesticides. It's pretty simple. And in the United States, the big consequence of GM is significant reduction of pesticide use, which has positive effects, obviously, in terms of reduced chemical loading in our waters and less exposure to chemicals, farm chemicals for farm workers. GM is no magic bullet, but GM does offer us some advantages for particular contexts. I absolutely think we need to make it available where we can do so safely. We need effective biosafety protocols in place, but outright bans on genetically modified organisms in agricultural systems in the developing world is crazy, frankly. Was that sufficiently controversial to close?
It definitely was a very clear statement. So this concludes today's seminar. I would like to thank Chris, Manu, and Mark for a very interesting and far-reaching presentation and discussion. And we will have another set of seminars in the spring semester, so watch out for the announcement, and I hope I will see many of you there. So let's give a round of applause to our speakers.